Welcome to episode 4, which is focusing on government distrust in the United States. And we're focusing today on distrust through the periods of Reconstruction through the Vietnam era. In episode 3, we began with the protests of January 6th, 2021. Our goal was to identify if Trump supporters were justified in suspecting that the election results were incorrect, and in fact Donald Trump was the true elected president of the election that took place in 2020. We looked at the extreme distrust in the election results that moved a large group to protest in front of the Capitol and eventually break the law by trespassing, assaulting law enforcement officers, and other crimes. Our question was, is this something new or merely a continuation of the American experience? In order to answer that, we looked in our last episode at some of the themes which led to extreme distrust with the Parliament of Great Britain in colonial times, ultimately leading to the War of Independence. We also looked at the tariff crisis, the nullification crisis, and secession. What we found was that instead of these events being relics of the past, we identified and discussed the current examples of how states are passing legislation to bypass federal, state, and local tax deduction limits, which benefit small business owners at the expense of W-2 wage earners, as well as President Biden's failed attempt to pass federal voting laws, which were designed to bypass state laws. And we noted how states have the power documented in the Constitution that states can develop their own election regulations, timing, and practices. We looked at how nullification, the states nullifying federal laws, and state laws being passed to bypass federal ones were key causes for the secession of the southern states. Of course, another main reason was that the southern states wished to preserve the institution of slavery. As we continue our journey through the history of our nation and look for these themes of distrust, we're going to start with the Credit Mobilier scandal of 1872. As a refresher, the late 1800s was the era of the railroad. Constructed by immigrants but run by capitalists, the railroads were a great bubble, similar to the internet bubble of the late 90s, early 2000s. They were similar in that there was a speculative stock price run-up and lucrative bonds fueling the expansion of railroad companies. It was an accelerating land grab for money, and a real land grab for land grabs. Many of the railroads were unprofitable, and when the bubble burst in 1873, 2 decades of economic depression followed, which were marked by a steep and steady drop in economic activity and high unemployment. In other words, a very painful period. But let's back up to 1872, the year before the bubble burst. In 1872, the Union Pacific was building the railroad in the vast unpopulated territories between Omaha and the Great Salt Lake. Mere operation of the railroad alone would unlikely be profitable. The railroad companies knew that they could gain profits through sales of lucrative bonds to the government, land contracts, and other government contracts. Exposed by The Sun, a newspaper in New York, Credit Mobilier was a shell company formed by representatives of the Union Pacific Railroad who used stock to bribe representatives in Congress, including Schuyler Colfax, Speaker of the House and later Vice President. They did this by selling them shares at a low price. The shares would then be used at a later date as a mechanism to dispense profits. In return, congressmen would support the interests of the Union Pacific Railroad through government construction contracts, awarding lucrative bonds and millions of acres of land. Oakes Ames, a representative from Massachusetts, was a chief participant, as was James Brooks of New York. Both were censured by the House for their role in the scheme. Censure is a mark of the House's extreme displeasure, but does not meet the threshold for expulsion. Expulsion is the gravest punishment. In case you're interested, a reprimand is a lighter rebuke than censure. The scandal highlighted how public officials could be bought off by outside influences to benefit themselves and corporations at the expense of the people through the manipulation of illegal government contracts. The railroad companies believed that construction projects would be more profitable than the operation of the railroad itself once in service. In conclusion, the average person would lose confidence in their elected government officials, increasing distrust and sentiment of the powerful. The timing of this scandal, taking place after the Civil War, led to distrust in Reconstructionist policies at the time. Let's move forward to 1921 to 23, the Teapot Dome scandal, which involved the bribery of high-level government officials to lease oil reserves to private companies at low prices without competitive bids. Oil fields under Teapot Dome were used by the Navy for fuel oil to power ships, an innovation over using relatively inefficient coal. The oil-rich lands were under the control of the Department of Navy until 1921, when President Harding transferred the control of the lands from the Navy to the Department of the Interior. He did this through an executive order. Interior Secretary Albert Fall, a cabinet-level position, then leased the lands at a very low price to two private oil companies without a competitive bidding process. Although the leases themselves were not illegal, the oil companies paid Fall a total of around $500,000, or $7 million in today's money, which was illegal. The matter was initially brought to the attention of Wyoming Senator John B. Kendrick by a Wyoming oilman who noticed Sinclair trucks hauling gear into the Teapot Naval Reserve. The scandal was further exposed by Carl McGee, later the founder of the Albuquerque Tribune, who noticed a change in Fall's fortunes. Fall had paid up his ranch taxes that had been overdue for 10 years, and McGee brought the matter up to the attention of a Senate investigation. Civil and criminal lawsuits followed. The Supreme Court found that the leases were illegally granted, and the control of the lands were returned to the Navy Department. Fall was fined and imprisoned. In conclusion, cabinet-level corruption for personal enrichment and the benefit of oil companies created lasting mistrust. As an example of this, the first Gulf War, where Iraq had invaded Kuwait and threatened the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, was viewed by critics as a war for oil. The Vietnam War. Involvement in unwinnable wars against other political systems creates loss of confidence in leaders' ability to extricate U.S. armed forces from impossible situations and positions. The Vietnam War was a tragic failure for the U.S. President Truman and Eisenhower were motivated by fear of the spread of communism. Their fear was greater than the actual threat, and the medicine ended up being worse than the disease. After 100 years of failed French colonial policy, Truman and Eisenhower let their emotions about communism affect their decision-making. But so did three following presidents. Prior to U.S. involvement, the idea of using tactical nuclear bombs to support French forces at Dien Bien Phu was proposed. Thankfully, Eisenhower rejected the idea. President John F. Kennedy, initially assessing the situation in French Indochina correctly in 1954, stated, "I am frankly of the belief that no amount of American military assistance in Indochina can conquer an enemy which is everywhere and at the same time nowhere, an enemy of the people which has the sympathy and covert support of the people." JFK later changed his position to support South Vietnam against the North Vietnamese during his presidential campaign. He did this in order to address the perception amongst Americans that he was soft on communism. Just so that we can all understand the situation the U.S. was wading into, let's back up and understand some of the history of the region. Indochina was part of the Khmer Empire, a Hindu-Buddhist empire of Southeast Asia. France became involved through French Jesuit priests that established missions in the area during the 17th century. The French East India Company, a company set up to establish trade and spread Catholicism, had become active in the area beginning around 1668. In late 18th century and early 19th century, the French became involved in land disputes and also engaged to protect missionaries. Local leaders had become threatened by rising Catholicism, which sparked conflict. The French, with Spanish support, increased support through ships and men to consolidate control over the provinces. By 1864, most of Vietnam fell under French control. The French were interested in increasing revenues and selling French goods to the Vietnamese. Through until the late 1890s, Vietnam was costing the French more than the revenues that were being collected. In order to reverse this and grow revenues, the French colonial governor encouraged opium use and then raised taxes on opium once enough people were addicted. Heavy taxes were also raised on rice and rice wine and alcohol. Vietnamese who could not or would not pay their taxes often lost their houses and lands and were forced to become day laborers. The French took over the lands of these poor farmers and then paid them to plant and harvest rice. Through these economic policies, Vietnam became the third largest rice exporter after Burma and Thailand. From 1940 through 1946, Ho Chi Minh helped create the Viet Minh. After the French were forced out by the Chinese in 1945, the Viet Minh resisted the Japanese influence and control of the region. During World War II, the U.S. provided support to Ho Chi Minh through the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, the CIA's predecessor, to help locate downed aircraft. The U.S. was popular for having helped repel the Japanese occupiers. Harry Truman supported French colonial involvement in Vietnam and helped them get reestablished. No sooner had the French arrived back in Vietnam than fighting broke out with Ho Chi Minh's forces. A major defeat of the French occurred at Dien Bien Phu, which was a battle that took place from 13th of March 1954 through the 7th of May. Dien Bien Phu was intended as a trap created by the French to lure Ho's forces into a killing field. Instead, General Giap of the Viet Minh turned tables on the French. The French believed that they could be resupplied by air, thinking that the North Vietnamese did not have any anti-aircraft guns. However, the Viet Minh brought up artillery, including anti-aircraft guns, up the side of the mountain, and then tunneled through to train their guns on the French position. There were ground battles, and after 2 months' siege, the French surrendered their position in a major defeat, and the French government in Paris resigned. While the siege was taking place, the Pentagon recommended the use of 3 nuclear weapons to support the French. The National Security Council recommended 1, but Eisenhower refused. Following the French withdrawal, an independent North and South Vietnam were created in 1954. The states were divided by the 17th parallel, according to the 1954 Geneva Accords. A unifying election was to take place in 1956. However, the elections never took place, as CIA Director Allen Dulles believed the people would overwhelmingly vote for the Viet Minh. Eisenhower believed that Vietnam was in the U.S.'s strategic interest and that it must remain democratic. He asserted Vietnam's right to choose their form of government, but privately worried about letting Vietnam fall to communism. Under President Eisenhower, the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam began to escalate in 1956 and grew into the Vietnam conflict, although technically not a war, as although Congress authorized the use of armed force in 1964 following the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Eisenhower was influential in the thinking of JFK, LBJ, Richard Nixon, and Gerald Ford. JFK in 1954 commented, "I am frankly of the belief that no amount of American military assistance can conquer an enemy which is everywhere and at the same time nowhere." His tune changed in 1960 when running for president, as he was viewed as being soft on communism. Once president, JFK supported Vietnam with men, material, including napalm, Agent Orange, and 16,000 military advisors that began engaging directly in contact with the North Vietnamese. Following JFK's assassination in 1963, President Lyndon Baines Johnson continued to support the South Vietnamese. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, taking place in August of 1964, resulted in Congress's granting the president expanded war powers, which LBJ used to support the South Vietnamese. The South was on the verge of collapse at that point. This marked a new stage of direct U.S. involvement in the Vietnam conflict. Troop levels in Vietnam increased to 400,000 by 1965 and 500,000 by 1967. By March 1968, President Johnson announced that he will not run for re-election after facing a withering backlash against Americans' involvement in the Vietnam conflict. Republican Richard Milhous Nixon won the 1968 presidential election, prevailing over Democrat Hubert Humphrey and third-party candidate George Wallace. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama who wanted to bring back segregational policies to America. Interestingly, Wallace's campaign addressed federal government powers and control of people's daily lives. He criticized the Civil Rights Bill as taking away ownership of private property,